February 3rd, 1945. 25,000 feet above the industrial sprawl of Berlin, where winter air at altitude registered 40 degrees below zero and ice crystals formed microscopic daggers that could kill an unprotected human in minutes. Captain Robert Fesmer, United States Army Air Forces, felt his vision narrow to a tunnel as the oxygen flow to his mask dropped from steady stream to nothing. A failure so sudden and complete that his brain, starved for oxygen at an altitude where ambient air contained perhaps a third of the oxygen available at sea level, began shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core survival processes. Around him, the cockpit of his B-17 Flying Fortress held 9 other men, all dependent on the oxygen system that had just catastrophically failed, all experiencing the same hypoxic spiral that killed bomber crews with mechanical efficiency when life support systems malfunctioned at altitudes where human physiology could not function unaided. The formation of 379th Bombardment Group B-17s continued toward their target, unaware that one aircraft in their stream carried a crew that had perhaps 90 seconds of useful consciousness remaining before hypoxia rendered them incapable of coordinated action. Fesmier's hands moved on autopilot, trained reflexes executing emergency procedures that had been drilled into muscle memory through hundreds of hours of training. Check oxygen regulator. No flow. Check emergency oxygen bottle. Pressure 0, already depleted during the climb to altitude when the primary system had shown intermittent function. Check bailout oxygen bottles. Missing. Removed during pre-flight to save weight on a mission where every pound reduced bomb load. The options prescribed by emergency procedures had been exhausted in perhaps 5 seconds. Standard protocol was clear. Emergency descent to 10,000 feet where humans could breathe ambient air without supplemental oxygen, abort mission, return to base. But emergency descent from formation meant collision risk with other aircraft, meant breaking radio discipline to warn surrounding bombers, meant abandoning the mission that had cost weeks of planning and had already consumed the fuel that made return to England marginal, even if they turned back immediately. And most critically, emergency descent required coordinated action by a crew that was losing consciousness at the rate of approximately 10% per 15 seconds, whose fine motor control was already compromised, whose decision-making capacity was degrading toward the kind of euphoric confusion that made hypoxia victims believe everything was fine even as they died. Fesmier could feel it happening, the edges of his vision darkening, his thoughts slowing, the insidious sense that the situation was less urgent than it actually was. Hypoxia killed through deception, making victims believe they were functioning normally even as their brains systematically shut down. He had perhaps 45 seconds of useful consciousness remaining. Perhaps 60 if he was lucky. Perhaps 30 if his physiology was less resilient than average. In that window, he needed to restore oxygen flow to himself and 9 other men. Or he needed to descend the aircraft to breathable altitude. Or everyone aboard would lose consciousness and the B-17 would continue flying on autopilot until fuel exhaustion or structural failure ended the flight in whatever manner gravity and aerodynamics dictated. By February 1945, the strategic bombing campaign over Germany had become a war of attrition where American numerical superiority compensated for losses that remained horrific by any objective measure. Bomber crews flew 25 mission tours knowing that statistical survival probability hovered around 50%. Better than the early war period when survival rates approached 0, but still a calculation that made every mission a measured gamble with death. The B-17 Flying Fortress had earned its name through rugged construction that allowed aircraft to return from missions with catastrophic damage. But ruggedness meant nothing when life support systems failed at altitudes where human biology simply could not function. The oxygen system in a B-17 was complex. A high-pressure bottle farm feeding regulators that stepped pressure down to breathable levels, distributed through hoses to 10 crew positions, monitored by gauges that showed flow rate and pressure. The system included redundancies, backup bottles, emergency equipment, but complexity meant failure points, and at 25,000 feet in ambient temperatures that froze metal and shattered rubber seals, systems designed to function reliably at ground level became temperamental machines that failed in ways no manual adequately predicted. Fesmier's co-pilot, Lieutenant James Morrison, had already slumped in his seat, unconscious or near unconscious, his oxygen mask hanging loose where it had fallen when his hands lost the motor control necessary to maintain grip. The navigator's voice came over the intercom, slurred and confused. "Captain, I can't remember the heading. What are we doing?" The question was symptomatic. Hypoxia victims lost higher cognitive functions first, memory and judgment degrading before basic physical function failed. When crew members started asking confused questions about basic mission parameters, it meant they had perhaps 30 seconds before unconsciousness. The German fighters that had been harassing the bomber formation throughout the approach to Berlin expected American bombers to maintain formation discipline, to fly predetermined courses toward predetermined targets, to operate according to doctrine that emphasized coordination over individual initiative. What they did not expect, what no tactical analysis had prepared them for, was a B-17 that would do what Fesmeyer was about to attempt, a solution so improvised and so dependent on individual technical knowledge that it existed outside any emergency procedure manual or training curriculum. Fesmeyer's vision was now reduced to a narrow tunnel, his peripheral sight gone, his brain conserving oxygen for core visual processing. His hands felt distant, disconnected, but they still responded to conscious command. He reached up to the overhead panel where the oxygen system master controls were located, grabbed the main oxygen feed line, a reinforced rubber hose perhaps an inch in diameter, and pulled it free from its mounting bracket. The line, pressurized to approximately 400 psi from the bottle farm, hissed as he disconnected it from the regulator system that had failed. Raw oxygen, unregulated, flowed from the open line at pressure high enough to damage lungs if breathed directly, but also high enough to be distributed through improvised means if someone understood the physics of pressure and flow. What Fesmeyer did next would be documented in technical reports, analyzed by life support engineers, and eventually incorporated into emergency training as an example of field improvisation that saved lives through understanding of systems at a level deeper than procedural knowledge. He took the disconnected oxygen line, brought it to his face, and breathed directly from the high-pressure flow, not through his mask, not through any regulator, but straight from the line. In short, controlled inhalations that delivered oxygen at concentrations far higher than normal breathing, but at pressures low enough that he could manage them without causing immediate lung damage. The effect was instantaneous. His vision cleared, his thoughts sharpened. The hypoxic confusion that had been pulling him toward unconsciousness reversed as his brain received the oxygen it had been starved for. Fesmeyer had perhaps 3 seconds of clarity before he would need to breathe again. 3 seconds to make decisions about how to save 9 other men who were now unconscious or nearly so. He could not use the same technique for his crew. Passing a high-pressure oxygen line between 10 crew positions would take time they did not have, would require coordination from men who were already beyond the ability to coordinate. He needed a solution that would deliver oxygen to multiple positions simultaneously, that would work without requiring conscious cooperation from hypoxic crew members, that could be implemented in the seconds available before everyone aboard became incapable of any action. The symbolic object that defined this moment was not equipment or technology, but something more fundamental. The walk-around oxygen bottle, a portable high-pressure cylinder that crew members could disconnect from fixed stations and carry when moving through the aircraft. Each B-17 carried several, positioned at various stations for use during in-flight movement when crew members needed to leave their primary positions. Fesmeyer had noted during pre-flight that the walk-around bottles were fully charged, had calculated their volume and pressure, had stored that information in the mental catalog that experienced pilots maintained about their aircraft's systems. He grabbed his own walk-around bottle, connected it to his mask, took 3 deep breaths of regulated oxygen that further cleared his hypoxic confusion, then moved through the aircraft with the bottle. A process that would have been routine at lower altitude, but that at 25,000 feet in a deep pressurized aircraft represented a race against time measured in seconds. He reached the co-pilot first, connected Morrison's mask to the walk-around bottle, held it in place while Morrison's breathing reflexes drew oxygen into starved lungs. Morrison's eyes focused after perhaps 10 seconds, consciousness returning with the characteristic confusion that marked recovery from hypoxia. "Hold this," Fesmeyer commanded, placing Morrison's hand on the oxygen bottle. "Don't let go. Breathe. Then he moved aft, toward the navigator's position, toward the bombardier's station, toward the radio operator and the gunners, carrying additional walk-around bottles that he collected from their storage positions, connecting masks, forcing oxygen into unconscious men whose breathing had become shallow or stopped entirely. The process took perhaps 2 minutes. 2 minutes during which the B-17 continued flying in formation, maintained by autopilot and by the basic aircraft stability that allowed bombers to fly hands-off for extended periods. 2 minutes during which Fesmire moved through the aircraft connecting improvised oxygen supplies to crew members who would have been dead within another minute, without intervention. The transformation that Fesmire's improvised fix represented was both technical and philosophical. Technically, he had recognized that oxygen system failure did not mean oxygen absence, that high-pressure bottles remained charged even when distribution systems failed. That basic understanding of fluid pressure and flow allowed bypassing failed regulators through direct application of source materials. Philosophically, he had demonstrated the American military principle that emphasized systems knowledge over procedural compliance, that trained personnel to understand why equipment functioned rather than simply how to operate it according to checklist, that valued the kind of deep technical literacy that enabled field repairs when standard procedures provided no solution. The German defenders tracking the bomber formation did not know that one B-17 had just recovered from total oxygen system failure through improvised life support. They saw only a formation that maintained integrity, that continued toward target, that showed no sign of the catastrophic emergency that should have forced at least one bomber to break formation and descend. The psychological impact of American bomber formations that simply would not break, that maintained cohesion despite flak, and fighters and system failures contributed to the broader erosion of German defensive confidence in the final months of the war. Fesmire's aircraft completed its bomb run, delivered its ordnance on target, and returned to England on improvised oxygen supply that required crew members to share walk-around bottles through carefully coordinated breathing rotation. The flight back took 3 hours and 40 minutes, during which Fesmire calculated oxygen consumption against remaining bottle pressure with the precision of someone who understood that math errors would kill. They landed with bottles depleted to near-zero pressure, and crew members experiencing the kind of exhaustion that came from extended periods of oxygen deprivation, followed by extended periods of heightened stress. The post-mission technical inspection documented catastrophic failure of the primary oxygen regulator system, a combination of frozen seals and pressure valve malfunction that had cut oxygen flow to all stations simultaneously. The failure mode was rare but not unknown, documented in perhaps a dozen previous incidents where crews had either successfully descended to breathable altitude or had been lost when hypoxia incapacitated everyone aboard before emergency procedures could be executed. Fesmire's solution, bypassing the failed regulator system through direct use of high-pressure bottles and walk-around supplies, was noted in the inspection report with the dry technical language that characterized military documentation. Crew survived oxygen system failure through improvised emergency procedures not covered in existing manual. What the inspection report did not capture was the broader significance of what had occurred. Fesmire's fix was possible only because American training emphasized technical understanding at a level that most other air forces did not match. Pilot training in the U.S. Army Air Forces included extensive mechanical instruction, required pilots to understand aircraft systems from electrical to hydraulic to environmental, emphasized troubleshooting skills that went beyond checklist procedures. This approach was expensive in training time and resources, but it produced pilots who could respond to emergencies that no manual anticipated, who could improvise solutions based on fundamental understanding of how systems worked rather than merely how to operate them under normal conditions. The walk-around oxygen bottles that Fesmire had used to save his crew represented American abundance even in specialized equipment. Each B-17 carried multiple portable oxygen sources because American logistics could afford redundancy, because manufacturing capacity allowed equipping aircraft with backups to the backups. German bombers, operating under much tighter resource constraints, typically carried minimal emergency oxygen supplies, relying on primary systems to function reliably because replacing them when they failed was not feasible given limited production capacity. In the weeks following the mission, Fesmeyer's emergency procedure was incorporated into aircrew survival training. A technical bulletin was distributed to bombardment groups describing the improvised oxygen distribution technique, with careful warnings about the dangers of breathing high-pressure oxygen directly and instructions on proper use of walk-around bottles as emergency backup systems. The bulletin was characteristically American in its approach. It did not criticize Fesmeyer for deviating from procedure, did not suggest his improvisation was reckless, but instead documented what had worked and distributed that knowledge throughout the force with the implicit acknowledgement that emergencies required creative solutions that manuals could not anticipate. Fesmeyer flew 18 more missions before the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. He survived them all, completed his combat tour, returned to the United States, and worked as a commercial pilot for 37 years. When asked about the oxygen system failure that should have killed him and his crew, he would note simply that understanding how things work is more important than memorizing procedures. That good training teaches you principles so you can solve problems no one has seen before. That the difference between living and dying sometimes comes down to whether you understand your equipment well enough to fix it when it breaks. The seconds that Fesmeyer had available to solve the oxygen crisis, that narrow window between recognizing system failure and losing consciousness, represented the margin on which survival operated at 25,000 feet, where human physiology could not function unaided. In those seconds, he had drawn on training that emphasized understanding over procedure, had applied knowledge of pressure systems and oxygen physiology that went deeper than checklist memorization, had improvised a solution that worked not because it was elegant or officially approved, but because it was based on correct understanding of how oxygen bottles, pressure regulators, and human respiratory systems actually functioned. The fix he built in those seconds, disconnecting failed regulators, redistributing walk-around bottles, manually controlling oxygen flow through understanding of pressure and volume, saved 10 lives through technical literacy that exemplified American training philosophy. The Germans, who had begun the war with arguably the most technically sophisticated air force in the world, had not emphasized the same depth of systems knowledge in their pilot training, had assumed that well-designed equipment would function reliably, and that crews needed only operational knowledge rather than maintenance-level understanding. By 1945, that assumption had proven inadequate against an enemy that trained every pilot to be part mechanic, every crew member to understand systems at levels that enabled field repair and improvisation. In the end, the oxygen system failure at 25,000 feet and Fesmeyer's improvised fix represented more than a single crew's survival. It represented the advantage that came from training that emphasized depth over breadth, understanding over procedure, technical literacy over operational competence. The walk-around bottles that saved 10 men were simply hardware, available to any air force with adequate manufacturing capacity. But the knowledge of how to use them as improvised life support, the understanding of pressure and flow that enabled bypassing failed regulators, the technical confidence that allowed a pilot to improvise solutions in seconds while his brain was starving for oxygen, that was uniquely American. The product of a training system that believed survival required not just following procedures, but understanding the principles that made procedures work, so that when procedures failed, as they inevitably did in combat, pilots possessed the knowledge to invent new ones in the seconds available before death rendered invention irrelevant.